Thanks for tuning in to watch The Ordinary Filmmaker. Are you looking for a lens for your Canon 90D? Perhaps your 80D? Or maybe you have another aps-c DSLR such as the Rebel T8i or the 70D, 50D, or even something older. This video is all about the best lens that you can get for your aps-c camera like the 90D here in 2022. And I've got a lot of lenses to go through. But before I get into my first lens pick, I want to say something very, very important. There are tons of reviews out there, but a lot of these reviews are written from the viewpoint of a photographer. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not here to beat up on photographers. The capabilities needed by a videographer are very different, and one of those being sound. Looking at picking up a new lens, see a great review on a Sigma 18-55 or some other lens combination focal length. Well, one thing you want to ask is, how loud is that focus motor? How loud is stabilization? Because if you're just using the in-camera microphone or an attached microphone, it can really make a huge difference. The focus motor can be loud enough that it really does ruin your end product. So as I do reviews on all the lenses here, I'm going to let you know which lenses are really great for video and which lenses not so much. For a general purpose lens, this is a zoom lens. It's the Canon 18-135. Now there's three different variants out there. I'm going to cover off each one. This one is the STM. Prior to this, I had the 18-135 USM, and this is going back probably about 7 years. It took really good stills. As far as sharpness from the center to the edges, chromatic aberration, for its price point, it performed really, really well. But for the first year and a half of shooting videos, I constantly had that sort of, well, the sound that a mouse would make if it was chewing on a nut. And it was really irritating. It wasn't super loud, but it was distracting. So when Canon came out with the STM version, I bought it right away, and lo and behold, all those audio issues went away. And at the time, I also upgraded to a microphone, a shotgun microphone. It's around $200. It's by Sennheiser. It's the MKE400. This is highly recommended if you're shooting outside, you're on vacation, plug it into your Canon 90D, your Canon 80D, whatever DSLR you have, and it's going to record really good audio even if you're in wind. And if you're in really heavy wind, it does have a wind filter as well. And the sound of wind with this microphone, well, it sounds like wind. It doesn't sound like fingers on a chalkboard, which is really good. But I did notice a loss of sharpness going to the STM over the USM. However, when Canon came out with the 80D, they offered a kit for it with a new updated version of the 18-135 USM. And I gotta say, this one is silent, it's quiet, and the quality is what you would expect from a USM. In fact, I'd say this lens, other than not having weather sealing, is pretty close to the quality you'd expect from an L series. It's not quite L series, but the quality is very good, and you can see there's a ton of reviews saying how good this kit lens is with the 80D. And I stand by it. I say this, I think this lens, if you're only going to buy one lens for video and stills, it produces really, really good shots. And it also has image stabilization. This is important. None of Canon's DSLRs, past or present, offer in-body image stabilization. And as a video shooter, it's very, very important. So as a general purpose lens, this is my number one. And also another thing this can help teach you as well is, what would it be like if you got a 24mm, a 50mm, or anything up to 135mm? Just simply set the focal length to that desired length. And what I highly recommend you do is try shooting at that 50mm. If things aren't framed properly, don't adjust the zoom or the focal length. Move forward or move backwards, and you're going to get a better sense for what it's going to be like to live with a 50mm, with an 85mm, with a 35 or a 24. For the 7 years, well, I guess going on 8 years that I had my Canon 70D, most of the times I either had this lens on here, the 18-135. Essentially, the 18-135 was my go-to lens, but the next lens I fell in love with that I used almost as much was the Canon EF 50mm f1.2, and this is L series glass. It's weather sealed. It produces really good sharpness from the center to the edges, regardless of the aperture. Just a really incredible lens. I didn't use it a whole lot at first, but I grew to love it. Now, its focus motor does make noise, but I found that with the Sennheiser MKE 400 on top, it didn't pick up on the focus motor that much at all. It actually worked out quite well, but in certain situations, I would just mic up a Tascam DR10L, and that eliminated that problem whatsoever. But there's doing interview shots. My channel, I shoot with a 50mm all the time, only in this case, I'm using the RF 50mm f1.2. But the reason why I recommend the EF version, and while I still think the 18-135 is a great go-to lens, I highly recommend focusing on EF lenses, not EF-S lenses, and the 18-135 is an EF-S. And why is that? Migration. You might think that the camera you have right now, whether it's a 90D or not, is the best camera for you right now, and you probably won't upgrade for many years. But when you do upgrade, Canon's not going to have any new DSLRs coming out. It's all about the new RF system, or the RF mount, the R system. And Canon's going to start producing aps-c cameras for that mount as well. Using this little guy here, it's only $100, so this is the EF to RF mount. Put it on the R5 and you can bring over all your EF-S and your EF lenses, but the difference is when you mount an EF-S, you maintain that 60% crop. You can't shoot, 4K 120? There's a few restrictions when you shoot with EF-S, but when you bring over EF lenses, you don't have those restrictions. So I highly recommend buying EF glass. Now the 50mm f1.2 isn't the cheapest lens out there, but this is where I recommend looking at the used market. If you can pick up a used 50mm EF lens, 1.2, you're going to be really, really happy with it. It is a little bit heavy, but I can't say enough about it. It's really, really good. It opens up to 1.2, and when you're shooting inside or low light situations, especially for video, with stills, it doesn't matter so much because you can play around with the shutter, but when you're shooting with video, your shutter speed should always be twice that. Your denominator should always be twice that of your frame rate. So I shoot 30 frames per second all the time, so my shutter's 1/60th. If you're shooting 24 or 25, it should be 1/50th. And I'm not going to get into the details, but that's generally a rule of thumb when it comes to shooting video. There is another lens you could consider getting, and it's a much cheaper lens. It's for under $100. It's the EF 50mm, their nifty 50 1.8, and this is it here. It's right on the Canon 70D. It's a really, really good lens. It's pretty cheap. You can get them used pretty cheap as well, but it doesn't have image stabilization. And again, if you migrate it over to the R system at a later date, you're going to find it a little bit wanting. And I've got a bunch of EF-S lenses, as you can see here, and I love them on the R5. I get much better detail because I've got a bigger sensor, even though it's cropped. But there's some limitations. Like I said, you're always shooting in cropped mode. And one thing about having a large full-frame sensor is you want to take advantage of that full-size sensor, which is what EF-S lenses do, or sorry, EF lenses do. So which one should you go with? Well, what I would highly recommend is see what you can find on the used market. I know in 2020 and 2021, things have gotten rather expensive because of availability, and we're seeing that probably going to continue into 2023, but still keep an eye out for deals. I highly recommend the RF 50mm, no, the EF 50mm f1.2 as a really, really solid lens. This is a great lens to kind of play around with, and it's the EF-S 10 to 18mm. I still use this one on my R5. The one thing I find a little bit lacking, though, again, is the crop factor. I'm kind of stuck there, and I can't shoot 4K 120, which is something I'd really like to do. But on the Canon DSLRs, the 90D, the 80D, it's a really, really solid lens, and it's pretty cheap. I picked this up for $200 Canadian, or about 120 US, so that was used. You can get a lot of these EF-S lenses pretty cheap. On the R system, Canon just came out with a 16mm prime, which is something I'm keenly interested in. But to give you an idea, that lens is about $300 or $299 US, or about $500 Canadian after taxes, depending on what province you live in. So there can be a lot of gold in these old EF-S lenses, especially if you're going to stick on the platform. But again, I do recommend moving to the EF lenses. So what about some others? What about some Sigma? Like I said, Sigma and Tamron. Sigma and Tamron make a lot of great lenses, especially when it comes to super telephoto. On the Canon side, we are rather limited. For a couple of years, I shot with a Canon 100 to 400 millimeter. It's an L series. It produced really, really good quality. And because you're shooting with a Canon aps-c camera, you automatically get that 1.6 times crop, which works really great. It's equivalent to shooting at 160 to 6x4 640. So it's great for wildlife. A really, really terrific lens. Now, when I bought it probably about 5 years ago, I was able to pick it up for about 600 US or 1,000 Canadian. Buying this lens new isn't cheap even today, even though it's an older lens. So this is one of those, again, I'd really recommend keeping an eye out for used versions of this. And again, it's got that portability over to the RF or the RF mount, the R system. So what other lenses do I recommend for 2022? Well, I want to be brutally honest with you here. Once I got the 18 to 135, I was happy. I didn't think of getting another lens for many, many years. And when I did, it was a 50 millimeter, and that was because we wanted to take portraits and stills. And I started using it for video, and I found, wow, it's a great video lens. But outside of those two lenses, I really didn't have a need for much anything else. I want to tell you why I like the 18 to 135 so much. It's wide at 18 millimeters. If you're going to be in incredible scenic landscapes, for example, you're on top of Mount Washington in New Hampshire or Whiteface Mountain in New York, I never felt that I wasn't able to shoot wide enough. I found that 18 on an aps-c camera like the 90D was absolutely perfect. It did a really good job. Now with my R5, with a 24 to 105, it actually shoots a little bit wider, but still, I didn't feel like it's not wide enough. Now, if you go to other lenses, like what is it, the Canon 70 to 300 millimeter, which is a great zoom lens, at 70 millimeters, you're not going to be able to shoot wide. You're going to be a lot more cropped in. It doesn't work nearly as well as a general purpose lens. Or what about lenses that start at 55 millimeters, 55 millimeter to 200? I find that 55 millimeters is a little bit too cropped in. It's not wide enough. So I find that's why I really love the 18 to 135 millimeter. Yes, you can go out and get an additional lens like the 10 to 18 millimeter EF-S lens, but when you're traveling, the last thing you want to do is switch out a lens, or you want to monkey around with things. You want to travel light. And if you were going to travel and you only buy one lens, I would say it's got to be the 18 to 135 millimeter EF-S and get the recent one, the USM, and you're going to be happy both from a stills and video standpoint. Outside of that, like I said, the 50 millimeter I think is a great focal length. I also got the Canon EF 100 millimeter f2.8. It's a macro, and macros can be a lot of fun, especially on a crop sensor body. But you know what? After about a year or two, I kind of got tired of it, and well, I stopped using it. So much so, I sold it for $600 Canadian, 400 US, just a couple of years ago, just before I got the R5. I kind of wish I didn't, because I ended up buying the RF version, which is a little bit more expensive. And again, it's sat on the shelf for the last 3 or 4 months, but in the summertime is when I really love shooting with that. And what's kind of changed my view of that focal length is the ability to shoot video at 4K, 120 frames per second, slow motion, up close. It does really produce some incredible results, but even shooting at 4K HQ, 8K oversample 4K on the R5, just opens up a whole new world. And that's why I think it's also very important to look at your migration plan. Yes, you might only have an aps-c DSLR right now, whether it's the 90D, the 80D, or some other variant, or a Rebel series camera. You're going to spend a decent amount of money on these lenses, and be able to migrate them over to the RF mount really, really matters. And while the EF-S lenses, like the 18 to 135, are a good solid lens, this isn't going to do it for you once you move to full frame. On the full frame, I use the Canon 24 to 105 f4, and it's my go-to general purpose lens. It's quiet, it's great for video. And outside of that, again, I use the 50 millimeter. In fact, I use the RF 50 millimeter more than anything else. I just love the sharpness. I love that lens. It's a great prime. It's great for video. It's great for stills. And yes, I have some other lenses. I have this behemoth here. This here is the 800 millimeter with a 2x extender, and I've got a hood on it right now, which makes it look a little bit bigger. This thing here is incredible for shooting the moon, for shooting the stars. It's a great super telephoto. But on a crop sensor, you do have a few more options that are certainly more affordable. There's a lot of glass by Sigma, like the 150 to 600 millimeter. Of course, I really love the 100-400 millimeter L series by Canon, which you can get used and produces really good results. It's pretty quiet. I love that lens as well. But all the other lenses, there's so many out there. Now, if you're going to do astro, for example, then you want to go pretty wide. You want to get a prime. I would probably get something like a 16 millimeter. Generally, the best lens for astro is right around 20 millimeters, and that's on a full frame. So on an APS-C, you definitely want to be around 16 millimeters, and that should work really well. But you also want to be wide open. Shoot as wide open as you can. So I'd go with a prime, or not a prime, I'd go with an L series if you can, something really high quality, like an f1.2 and an f1.4. But this is one of the toughest things to recommend. Once you get out of the basics of like a general purpose lens, like the 24-105 for full frame, or an 18-135 USM for APS-C, once you know, and a 50 millimeter prime, it's really hard to go from there. It really depends on what you're trying to shoot and how creative you want to be. And like I said, you can make some purchases such as the 800 millimeter, and it's only going to be used occasionally when I want to shoot Jupiter, or when I want to shoot Saturn or the moon, or I want to shoot wildlife. Yes, it's great. I take it, I run with it, I have a lot of fun with it. In fact, it's got to be the one lens I have the most fun with. Oh, and one last thing. Please go ahead and like and subscribe. It really does help this channel grow, and I take it as a virtual pat on the back. That's it for now. Thanks so much for watching The Ordinary Filmmaker. If you do have any questions about any lens mentioned in this video, or any scenarios that you shoot in, drop me a question in the comment section down below, and I do my best to answer your questions. However, if you want to go a little bit more in depth, you want to do a lot of rapid fires of questions, you've got a lot you want to talk, I do offer a 1-hour consultation, and the link for that is in the description down below. That's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.